Bikers risk their lives to save a police K9. What happens next is unbelievable. The highway stretched endlessly beneath a moonlit sky, a silver ribbon cutting through the dark Texan plains. Connor Raven Hayes tightened his grip on the handlebars of his Harley, the deep rumble of the engine matching the steady thunder of his heart. Behind him, his gang, the Black Hawks, rode in a loose formation, leather jackets catching the wind as they carved through the night. It was a run like any other, a ride to clear their minds, to feel the pulse of freedom beneath their feet. But as they rounded a bend on the desolate road, a shadow caught Connor's eye, a figure barely visible against the cracked asphalt. Instinct made him slow down, signaling to the others to do the same. The gang came to a rolling stop, the air thick with the scent of hot metal and gasoline. The shape on the road whimpered, a low, broken sound that made Connor's gut tighten. As his headlights bathed the figure in a pale yellow glow, he saw it clearly. A dog, a German shepherd. Blood matted into its thick fur, one of its hind legs bent at an unnatural angle. Rick, his closest friend and second in command, swung off his bike with a grunt. "Shit," he muttered, stepping closer. "Looks bad." Connor crouched beside the animal, his fingers brushing against its trembling side. The dog's ears twitched weakly, its dark eyes flickering open. Even in pain, there was a sharpness in its gaze, an intelligence that told Connor this wasn't just any stray. "It's got a vest," Mason, one of the younger members, pointed out. He was right. Beneath the blood and dirt, a bulletproof vest clung to the dog's frame, though it had done little to prevent whatever had torn through him. Connor's eyes narrowed as he traced the letters embroidered on the side. K9 unit, a police dog. Rick exhaled sharply. "We should leave it." His voice was low, uncertain. "Last thing we need is the cops breathing down our necks." Connor didn't respond immediately. He knew the risk. The Blackhawks had enough problems without being tangled up in law enforcement business. But as he looked into the dog's eyes, he saw something familiar. Determination. The same kind he saw in his own reflection. This dog had fought for something. Maybe it was still fighting. "Help me lift him," Connor said, ignoring the murmur of protest from the others. Rick hesitated but then sighed, kneeling down. "You're a stubborn bastard, you know that?" he muttered. Together, they hoisted the wounded K9 into the sidecar of Connor's bike, careful not to jostle him too much. The dog let out a sharp breath, but it didn't struggle. It knew it was in no shape to fight. The ride back to the hideout was tense. Connor could feel the unease radiating from his crew. They were outlaws, not rescuers. But he also knew that loyalty meant everything, and this dog had belonged to someone who might be in trouble. When they pulled into the old auto shop that served as their base, the neon lights above flickered, casting long shadows over the scattered bikes and rusted tools. Connor and Rick carried the dog inside, laying him on an old work table. "We're really doing this?" Mason asked, his voice edged with disbelief. "Yeah," Connor said simply, grabbing a first aid kit from the shelf. "We are." As he cleaned the wounds, he found more than he expected. Bullet grazes, a deep gash along the ribs, bruises that hinted at a struggle. This dog had been through hell, but it wasn't just the wounds that caught his attention. Underneath the vest, strapped to the harness, was a small, battered camera, a body cam. Connor exchanged a glance with Rick. "Think it's still got footage?" Rick asked. "Only one way to find out." With careful hands, Connor removed the device, wiping away the grime. The screen was cracked, but when he pressed the power button, a flickering image appeared. The gang gathered around as the footage played, the tiny screen illuminating their faces in the dimly lit garage. The shaky, distorted video showed a wooded area, the sound of heavy breathing and distant voices filling the space. Then came the gunfire. Muffled shouts, a struggle. Through the chaos, a man's voice rang out, a firm, commanding tone. "Duke, heel! Stay with me!" The dog on the table let out a low, strained whimper, his ears twitching at the sound. His name was Duke. Then the screen flickered again, revealing a masked figure stepping into view. A gun was raised, more shots. The image tilted wildly before going dark. Silence followed. The gang stared at the screen, the weight of what they just witnessed sinking in. "That cop," Rick muttered. "He didn't make it, did he?" Connor swallowed hard. Or he's missing. Mason shifted uncomfortably. So what now? We turn the dog over to the cops? Let them deal with it? Connor's jaw tightened. If we do that, whoever did this could come back to finish the job. They left Duke for dead. They're not going to want anyone finding out what's on this. He gestured to the camera. Which means they'll be looking for it. Rick ran a hand through his hair. And now it's in our hands. Great. Connor looked down at Duke, the dog's chest rising and falling with slow, labored breaths. There was no question now. This wasn't just about a dog. This was about something bigger, something they'd stumbled into by accident. But now that they had, Connor wasn't about to walk away. We keep him, Connor said finally, his voice leaving no room for argument. We figure out what happened, and if his handler's still alive, we find him. The gang was silent, but the look on Rick's face told Connor he wasn't alone in this. He nodded, stepping back. Then I hope you know what the hell you're doing, boss, because we just made ourselves some serious enemies. Connor glanced at Duke, reaching out to scratch gently behind the dog's ear. Yeah, he muttered, I know. Outside, the night stretched on, quiet and still. But inside that garage, something had shifted. A choice had been made, and there was no turning back. The air inside the garage was thick with tension, the kind that made a man's pulse quicken and his instincts sharpen. The Blackhawks weren't the type to rattle easily, but something about this situation, the injured K9, the footage of an ambush, the mystery of what happened to Duke's handler, was enough to put even the most hardened of them on edge. Connor sat at the old workbench, the body cam lying in front of him like a ticking time bomb. The screen had gone black after the last bit of footage, but the weight of what they'd seen still clung to the room like a storm waiting to break. Duke lay on a worn-out blanket near the back of the garage, his breathing slow and uneven. He was resting now, but his ears twitched at every noise, his body still wound tight despite the exhaustion. Connor recognized that kind of tension. It was the kind of readiness that came from knowing the fight wasn't over, that it might never be over. Rick paced near the row of parked motorcycles, arms crossed, jaw clenched tight enough to crack a tooth. All right, he finally muttered. Let's just get this out in the open. We're keeping the dog. We're looking for answers. Fine. But what's the next move, Connor? We got no leads except for a bunch of gunfire and some masked bastards on that footage. He stopped, turning toward the workbench. What are we supposed to do? Start knocking on doors, asking if anybody's seen a missing cop? His words carried frustration, but not doubt. He was in, just like always. Connor leaned back, running a hand through his dark hair, his fingers brushing against the scar on his temple. No, he said, voice steady. We don't knock on doors. We figure out who the hell would want this dog and his handler dead. He tapped the body cam. And we start by seeing if there's anything else on here. Mason, perched on an old toolbox, frowned. It's busted, though. Screen's shot to hell. Yeah, Connor said, but the footage is probably still in the memory. He reached for his laptop, an old but reliable machine he kept around for business matters. Hacking wasn't exactly his specialty, but he knew enough to pull files when needed. Plugging in the camera, he let the computer work while the gang gathered closer, waiting. The screen flickered, and after a moment, rows of data appeared. Most of it was corrupted, scrambled beyond recognition, but one file remained intact, time-stamped just minutes before the ambush. Connor clicked it, and the video sprang to life. A wooded road, flashlights bobbing in the darkness, the sound of heavy boots crunching against dirt. You see anything? A voice whispered. Deep, steady, professional. Negative, another voice replied. Should have met us by now. Then a rustling, barely audible, a shadow moving between the trees. Then all hell broke loose. Gunfire erupted, the camera shaking as Duke lunged forward, his body a blur of motion. The first attacker barely had time to react before the dog took him down, but the numbers were against them. A figure emerged from the darkness, landing a hard blow to the camera's lens, sending the footage spinning. Then just before the feed cut out, a glimpse of something, an emblem on a jacket, a silver snake coiled around a dagger. Connor's stomach twisted. He knew that symbol. Son of a bitch, Rick muttered, leaning in closer. That's Vanguard Security. Mason looked between them. Who? private security firm, Connor said, his voice like gravel, but not the kind that protects banks or celebrities. They take the dirty jobs, the ones cops can't touch or won't touch. Mercenaries, basically. He exhaled slowly, his mind racing. And if they were involved in this, it wasn't just some random ambush, it was a hit. Rick swore under his breath. Then Carter, if he's alive, he's in deep. The weight of it settled over them like a shroud. If Vanguard was involved, it meant this wasn't just about Duke. It wasn't just about one missing cop. This was bigger and more dangerous. We need to find out what Carter was working on, Connor said. If Vanguard wanted him dead, then whatever he was investigating was a threat to them. Mason shifted uncomfortably. And how do you suggest we do that? We can't exactly walk into a police station and start asking questions? Connor's lips curled into a grim smile. But I know someone who might have answers. The room fell into silence as they all realized what that meant. The only way to get information on a case like this was to talk to someone on the inside. And for outlaws like them, that meant calling in a favor from someone who wasn't supposed to exist in their world. 2 hours later, Connor sat alone at a diner on the outskirts of town, sipping on a stale cup of coffee. The place was nearly empty, save for a few truckers nursing their meals and a waitress who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. The door creaked open, and a tall, lean man stepped inside, scanning the room before making his way over. Deputy Marshal Grayson had the look of someone who had seen too much and trusted too little. His badge was tucked under his jacket, but Connor knew it was there. Jesus, Grayson muttered as he slid into the booth. This better be good, Hayes. You know I ain't supposed to be seen with you. Connor set his cup down. Then let's make this quick. I need to know about James Carter. Grayson's expression didn't change, but Connor saw the flicker of recognition in his eyes. Why? Because I think he's in trouble. Real trouble. Connor leaned in. And I think the people responsible aren't going to stop at him. Grayson sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. You always did have a way of stepping into the worst kind of messes. He glanced around the diner before lowering his voice. Carter's been digging into something big. Word around the department is that he was on to some kind of internal corruption, dirty cops, deals going sideways. But 2 nights ago, he disappeared. No reports, no official investigation, just gone. Connor's jaw clenched. And nobody's looking for him. Nobody wants to, Grayson said, voice bitter. Because if Carter was right, then looking for him means shining a light on something that a lot of people want to keep buried. He exhaled. You're playing a dangerous game, Hayes. Connor smirked. Ain't the first time. Grayson shook his head. If you're serious about this, watch your back and keep that dog close. Because if Vanguard is involved, you're already on borrowed time. He slid out of the booth and left without another word. Connor sat there for a moment, staring at his untouched coffee. Then, without a second thought, he threw a few bills on the table and walked out into the night. The hunt for Carter had begun. The ride back to the garage was silent, the wind whipping against Connor's face as he pushed the throttle, the deep rumble of his Harley blending into the night. His mind churned through everything Grayson had told him, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place, but the picture it painted was grim. James Carter hadn't just been investigating dirty cops. He'd found something dangerous enough to get him erased. Vanguard Security wasn't just cleaning up loose ends, they were burying them. And now, by sheer chance or fate, Connor and his crew had stumbled right into the middle of it. As he pulled into the garage lot, the low glow of the overhead bulbs cast long shadows against the concrete, and he could see Rick waiting for him near the entrance, cigarette dangling from his lips, the ember burning bright in the darkness. Duke lay curled up on an old tarp, his ears twitching as he lifted his head at the sound of Connor's bike. The dog was getting stronger, his wounds healing faster than any of them had expected, but his eyes held something more than just recovery. They held recognition. He knew the fight wasn't over. Neither did Connor. Rick flicked his cigarette away as Connor killed the engine. You look like you just got handed a death sentence, he muttered, watching as Connor swung off the bike. Tell me something good. Connor exhaled through his nose, running a hand through his hair before meeting Rick's gaze. Carter's alive, he said, keeping his voice steady. Or at least he was 2 nights ago. Rick's eyebrows shot up, but he didn't interrupt. Connor leaned against his bike, crossing his arms. Grayson says he was digging into something big. Corrupt cops, illegal deals, something that had a lot of people looking over their shoulders. And when he got too close, he disappeared. No reports, no search. Just gone. Rick swore under his breath. So, what? You think Vanguard's holding him somewhere? Yeah, Connor nodded. And they don't want anyone asking questions? He looked down at Duke, who was still watching them, ears perked. Especially not him. Mason walked in from the back room, wiping grease off his hands. So what's the plan, boss? His voice held a note of uncertainty, like he already knew he wasn't going to like the answer. Connor met his gaze, his expression hard. We find Carter. Silence settled over the room. Rick rubbed his jaw, letting out a slow breath. You realize what you're saying, right? We go after Vanguard. We're not just poking the bear. We're kicking it in the damn teeth. Connor nodded. Yeah, I know. Rick studied him for a long moment, then huffed out a short laugh, shaking his head. Hell, all right, I'm in. Mason groaned. Jesus, I knew you were going to say that. He scrubbed a hand down his face before sighing. Fine, but we need a plan. Connor pushed off his bike, rolling his shoulders. We start with the footage. There's got to be something we missed. A face, a location, anything. They gathered around the laptop as Connor pulled up the files again, replaying the footage in slow motion. The gunfire, the struggle, the masked men, it all blurred together. But then, just before the camera went dark, something caught Connor's eye. A reflection in the distance, barely visible through the chaos. A neon sign, its glow flickering through the trees. Connor froze the frame, zooming in as much as the grainy footage would allow. That's a bar sign, Rick muttered, leaning closer. Lucky Jack's, Connor confirmed, recognizing the jagged lettering. It's off Route 19, about 10 miles from here. Mason let out a low whistle. You think that's where they took Carter? I think someone there knows something, Connor said. And we're going to find out what. Rick clapped his hands together. All right then, guess we're going out for drinks. An hour later, the Blackhawks rolled up to Lucky Jack's, the neon sign buzzing faintly as the bikes lined up outside. The bar was the kind of place where nobody asked questions and everybody had something to hide. The kind of place Connor had spent most of his life in. The moment they stepped inside, the smell of stale beer and cigarette smoke wrapped around them like an old coat. The place was crowded, filled with rough-looking men nursing cheap whiskey and cheap grudges. But Connor's attention zeroed in on a group near the back, a trio of men who didn't belong. They weren't locals. Their clothes were too clean, their boots too polished, and one of them, a burly man with a thick scar running down his cheek, was wearing a jacket with the faint imprint of a patch removed, a Vanguard patch. Rick followed Connor's gaze, smirking. Bingo! They didn't waste time. Moving through the crowd like sharks in deep water, they approached the table, and Connor pulled out a chair, sitting down like he owned the place. The scarred man stiffened, his companions exchanging wary glances. You lost? The man asked, his voice rough as gravel. Connor smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. Not at all. In fact, I think I just found exactly what I was looking for. The man's jaw clenched. You got the wrong table, friend. Connor leaned in slightly, his voice lowering. See, I don't think I do. I think you know a guy named James Carter, and I think you're going to tell me where he is. The air around them shifted, the bar noise fading into the background as the tension coiled tight. One of the other men reached under the table, but before he could grab whatever he was after, Rick was there, slamming a knife into the wooden surface, his grin sharp. Bad idea, he warned. Really bad idea. The scarred man exhaled through his nose, his fingers twitching. You don't know what you're getting into. That's funny, Connor said, tilting his head, because I was just about to say the same thing to you. The man weighed his options, then finally sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. They took him to a warehouse on the edge of town, old steel mill, shut down years ago. He's alive for now. But if you're thinking of getting him out, you're walking into a death trap. Connor stood, pushing his chair back with a scrape. Yeah, he said. I hear that a lot. Without another word, he turned and walked out, Rick and Mason right behind him. Outside, the night was cold. But Connor barely felt it. His mind was already moving ahead, calculating the next steps. Carter was alive. They had a location. Now all they had to do was get him out. Duke was waiting by Connor's bike, his dark eyes gleaming in the moonlight. Connor knelt beside him, scratching behind his ears. "We're gonna get him," he murmured. The dog didn't move, but his steady gaze told Connor everything he needed to know. They were in this together, and it wasn't over yet. The old steel mill loomed like a ghost in the distance, its rusted frame barely illuminated under the pale glow of the moon. Connor sat astride his Harley at the edge of an abandoned lot, his eyes fixed on the looming structure, his fingers drumming against the handlebar as he thought through their next move. Behind him, Rick and Mason waited in silence, the tension so thick it felt like a living thing curling around them. Duke sat alert beside Connor's bike, his ears pricked forward, his breathing steady but watchful. The dog knew. Just like them, he could sense the danger ahead. The information they'd gotten from the Vanguard thug at Lucky Jack's had led them straight here, but what lay beyond those rusted walls was still a mystery. James Carter was inside somewhere, but so were the men who had taken him, and if they were willing to ambush a cop in the dark, they weren't the type to go down easy. Connor swung his leg off his bike, rolling his shoulders. "We go in quiet," he murmured, keeping his voice low. "Get in, get Carter, get out. No unnecessary risks." Rick smirked. "Since when do we avoid risks? Since we're dealing with mercenaries who shoot first and don't bother asking questions?" Mason muttered, double-checking the pistol holstered at his waist. "This is suicide." "Not if we do it right," Connor said. "We don't go through the front. We find another way in." He turned his gaze toward the side of the building, where a broken fence led toward a set of loading docks that hadn't seen use in years. "There." They moved quickly, keeping low, their footsteps light against the cracked pavement. The mill was eerily quiet, the only sound the occasional creak of rusted metal shifting in the wind. Duke moved beside Connor, his posture tight, his head low. Every few steps, his nose twitched, sniffing the air. He was tracking something, someone. They reached the loading docks without incident, and Connor pressed his back against the wall, peering through a broken window. Inside, the mill was a mess of old machinery and scaffolding, dust hanging in the air like a forgotten memory. A single dim light flickered in the distance, casting long shadows across the concrete floor. And then he saw them. Two men standing near the center of the room, their rifles slung over their shoulders, talking in low voices. Connor glanced at Rick and Mason, nodding toward the window. "Two guards," he whispered. "We take them out quietly." Rick pulled a knife from his belt, testing the weight in his palm. "Quiet is my specialty." Before Connor could signal, Rick was already moving, slipping through the broken window like a shadow. Mason followed, his pistol raised, and Connor came in last, landing soundlessly on the cold floor. They moved in tandem, years of working together making their steps synchronized. Rick reached the first guard in seconds, his knife flashing in the dim light as he clamped a hand over the man's mouth, silencing him before dragging him down into the darkness. Mason took care of the second, a single muffled gunshot cutting through the air before he caught the body and lowered it to the ground. Connor exhaled, scanning the room. The way was clear, for now. He motioned for Duke to follow, and the dog moved with practiced precision, his paws making no sound as he padded forward. They moved deeper into the mill, past rusted beams and collapsed machinery, following the faint sound of voices coming from somewhere below. A staircase, old and warped, led downward, and Connor took point, his hand resting on the grip of his pistol as he descended. The air grew heavier the lower they went, damp and stale, the scent of oil and sweat mixing into something foul. At the bottom of the stairs, a heavy metal door stood slightly ajar, light spilling out from the gap. Connor pressed against the wall, listening. More voices. 3, maybe 4. One of them groaned, a sound of pain. Carter. Connor nodded to Rick and Mason, signaling that they were going in. Rick readied his knife. Mason cocked his pistol. Duke tensed, his muscles coiled, waiting for the command. Connor shoved the door open. The room was small, concrete walls stained with years of neglect. A single table sat in the center, a lamp casting weak light over the scene. Three men stood around a chair where James Carter was bound, his face bloodied, his uniform torn. One of the mercenaries held a knife, the blade pressed against Carter's arm, while the others watched, amused. The moment the door slammed open, chaos erupted. Connor didn't hesitate. His pistol was up before anyone could react, the first shot dropping the man with the knife before he even had time to turn. Rick lunged at the second, his blade sinking deep into the man's side before he could reach for his gun. The third mercenary fumbled for his weapon, but Duke was faster, launching forward with a snarl, his powerful jaws clamping around the man's wrist. The mercenary screamed, dropping his gun as Duke dragged him to the ground, his growls reverberating through the room. Carter, dazed but conscious, lifted his head, his eyes widening as he took in the scene. "What the hell? No time for questions," Connor cut in, moving to untie him. "We're getting you out of here." Carter winced as the ropes fell away, rubbing his wrists. "Who the hell are you guys?" "Friends of Duke," Rick said, wiping his blade clean. Carter's gaze flicked to the dog, who had released the mercenary's wrist but still stood over him, teeth bared. Recognition flashed in his battered face. "Duke," he murmured. The dog let out a low whine, his tail wagging slightly, as if confirming it was really him. "We need to move," Mason said. "We made enough noise to wake the dead." Connor helped Carter to his feet. "Can you walk?" Carter grunted, testing his weight on his legs. "I'll manage." They moved quickly, retracing their steps through the mill. The bodies of the guards remained where they had fallen, but as they reached the loading docks, the sound of engines roaring to life filled the air. Connor cursed. More were coming. "We're not out of this yet," he muttered. Rick scanned the area. "We split up. I'll take Mason and run interference. You get Carter and the dog out of here." Connor didn't like splitting up, but there wasn't time to argue. He gripped Rick's shoulder. "Don't get yourself killed." Rick smirked. "No promises." As Rick and Mason disappeared into the darkness, drawing attention away, Connor led Carter and Duke toward the back exit. The roar of motorcycles and the crack of gunfire echoed behind them, but Connor kept moving, his grip firm around Carter's arm. They burst into the open air, the night stretching wide before them. His bike was parked just outside the fence, and he didn't waste a second, swinging Carter onto the seat behind him. Duke leapt up effortlessly, settling between them. Connor gunned the engine. The tires screeched against the pavement as they tore away from the mill, gunfire chasing them but never catching up. The wind whipped against his face as they sped towards safety, Carter's grip tight around his waist, Duke's body pressed firm against them. They weren't in the clear yet, but they were alive, and that was enough. For now. The roar of Connor's Harley echoed across the empty Texas backroads, the cold night air slicing against his face as he pushed the bike to its limit. Carter clung tightly behind him, his grip firm but weakening, his body still battered from days of captivity. Duke, wedged between them, was steady as ever, his breathing rhythmic, despite the chaos they had just escaped. The distant crack of gunfire had faded, but Connor wasn't stupid enough to think they were in the clear. Vanguard security didn't let loose ends slip away, and by breaking Carter out, he had just painted a target the size of Texas on their backs. He needed a plan. Fast. The Blackhawks' garage was too hot now, too easy to track, too obvious. He needed somewhere else, somewhere no one would think to look. As his mind raced, his hands worked the throttle, the engine responding like it knew what was at stake. Behind him, Carter groaned, his head tilting forward slightly as exhaustion fought to take over. "Stay with me," Connor called back, his voice cutting through the wind. "We're not done yet." Carter gave a weak chuckle, but it was strained, forced. "Was afraid you'd say that." Connor swerved off the main road, taking a winding side route that led toward the outskirts of town, past miles of abandoned farmland and forgotten dirt trails. He knew where they were going now. An old hunting cabin his uncle used to own, deep in the woods, tucked far enough away that no one would find it unless they knew exactly where to look. He hadn't been there in years, but the last time he had checked, it was still standing. It would have to do. By the time they reached the gravel path leading to the cabin, Carter was barely conscious, his body slumping slightly against Connor's back. Duke let out a soft whine, nudging Carter's arm as if trying to keep him alert. "We're almost there," Connor muttered, more to himself than anyone else. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the worn wooden structure just ahead. It was smaller than he remembered, the roof sagging slightly, the porch creaking as the wind pushed against it. But it was shelter. Connor killed the engine and swung off the bike in one motion, catching Carter as he nearly collapsed. Duke jumped down immediately, circling them, his body tense, protective. All right, I got you," Connor grunted, slinging Carter's arm over his shoulder as he half-carried, half-dragged him up the steps. The door creaked as he shoved it open with his boot, dust swirling in the dim moonlight. Inside, the air was stale but dry, the furniture covered in sheets, the fireplace untouched for years. It would do. He eased Carter onto an old couch, then grabbed a nearby blanket and draped it over him. "You're not dying on me tonight," Connor muttered as he checked him over. The bruises were deep, his lips split, and there was a nasty wound on his side, but nothing life-threatening. "You a doctor now?" Carter rasped, cracking one eye open. "Because I gotta tell you, your bedside manner sucks." Connor smirked despite himself, shaking his head. "You'll live." He moved to the fireplace, tossing in some old logs and striking a match. Within minutes, the flames flickered to life, casting long shadows against the wooden walls. Duke settled near Carter's feet, his body finally relaxing, but his eyes never left the door. He was still on guard. Rick and Mason would make their own way back. Connor knew that much. They weren't reckless. If anyone could shake a tail, it was Rick. But that didn't mean they weren't still in deep shit. Vanguard wouldn't just let this slide. They would regroup, track their movements, and the next time they came, they wouldn't just be looking for Carter. They'd be looking to wipe out every last one of them. Connor sat back against the wall, rubbing a hand over his face. He had always lived on the edge, always thrived in chaos. But this was different. This wasn't about settling scores or running from the law. This was about something bigger, something deeper. Duke wasn't just a dog. He was proof of something, evidence that someone had gone too far, had crossed a line they shouldn't have. And Carter was the only one who knew exactly what that was. After a long silence, Carter shifted, his breathing slightly steadier now. "You didn't have to do this," he muttered. "You could have walked away." Connor leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Yeah," he admitted, "but I didn't." Carter let out a slow exhale, as if processing that. "I was investigating them," he said finally. "Vanguard. The whole operation is dirty. Contract killings, money laundering, selling weapons to people they shouldn't be. I got too close, started asking the wrong questions. Next thing I know, I'm in a ditch with a gun to my head, and they're telling me to keep my mouth shut. Then Duke, he fought, gave me a chance to run. I didn't make it far before they caught me, but they must have thought Duke was dead." He looked down at the dog, his hand resting on his head. "Guess he's harder to kill than they thought." Connor glanced at the fireplace, the flames crackling softly. "You got proof? Documents? Anything?" Carter shook his head. "Not with me. It's all on a hard drive, one I stashed before they grabbed me. They don't know where it is, which is the only reason I'm still breathing." Connor's jaw clenched. "Where?" Carter hesitated, then sighed. "Safe deposit box. Downtown." Connor swore under his breath. That was going to be a problem. Banks weren't exactly outlaw-friendly places, and waltzing in to retrieve a box while half the city was probably looking for them wasn't ideal. But if that drive had what they needed, if it could prove everything Carter was saying, then it was the only shot they had. "We'll figure it out," Connor said. "But first, you need rest. We move when you can stand on your own 2 feet again." Carter nodded weakly, his head tilting back against the couch as exhaustion finally claimed him. Duke stayed beside him, his breathing slow and steady now, his eyes half-lidded, but still alert. Connor sat back, staring at the ceiling, listening to the crackling fire. He had been in deep before, had taken risks that should have gotten him killed. But this was different. This wasn't just about them anymore. This was about exposing something bigger, something rotten. And if Vanguard wanted to play dirty, then they had no idea just how far Connor was willing to go. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, carrying the promise of another fight. Connor welcomed it. The morning came slowly, creeping in through the cracks in the cabin's wooden walls, spilling pale light over the dust-covered floorboards. Connor sat on the edge of an old wooden chair, rubbing his temples as the weight of the night pressed down on him. He hadn't slept. Not really. His mind had been too full, working through possibilities, threats, and outcomes. Across from him, Carter stirred, his body shifting slightly beneath the blanket Connor had thrown over him hours ago. The man looked like hell. His lip was swollen, one eye bruised nearly shut, and his wrists bore deep red marks where he'd been tied up for days. But he was alive, and for now, that had to be enough. Duke lay stretched out beside Carter, his head resting on his paws, eyes half closed but still alert, still watching the door like he knew this moment of peace wouldn't last. Connor had to agree with the dog's instincts. Vanguard wasn't the type to take a loss and move on. They were already looking for them, and the second they found a trail, they'd come hard. Rick and Mason still hadn't checked in, but Connor wasn't worried. Rick was like a damn ghost when he needed to be, slipping in and out of trouble without a trace. He'd get back when he was ready. Until then, Connor had to figure out their next move. Carter groaned, shifting upright, his eyes blinking against the morning light. He winced as he sat up, rolling his shoulders like every muscle in his body ached. "You look worse than me," he muttered, voice rough with exhaustion. Connor smirked, leaning back in the chair. "Yeah, well, I didn't get my ass kicked by a bunch of mercenaries." Carter gave a weak chuckle, but it faded quickly. He exhaled through his nose, rubbing at his temple. "Where are we?" "Middle of nowhere," Connor replied. "Safe for now. Won't stay that way." Carter nodded slowly, stretching his fingers before resting his hand on Duke's back. The dog let out a low, contented breath, but didn't move. "So, you're really doing this?" Carter asked. "Helping me take these bastards down?" Connor's jaw tightened. He thought about the footage from Duke's camera, the brutality of that ambush, the way Vanguard had tossed the dog aside like he was nothing, like Carter was nothing. He thought about how close they'd come to finishing the job. "Yeah," he said finally, "we're doing this." Carter studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, then we need that drive." Connor already knew that, but hearing it spoken aloud made the weight of it settle deeper. The safe deposit box downtown was their best shot at getting real leverage against Vanguard, but getting to it wasn't going to be easy. "Banks aren't exactly our playground," Connor muttered. "I don't need a withdrawal slip," Carter said, shaking his head. "Just a way in." Connor smirked despite himself. "That we can do." The problem was time. The longer they waited, the more Vanguard tightened their grip. They had to move fast, but Carter wasn't in any shape for a fight, and Connor wasn't about to drag a half-dead man through another battlefield. Before he could say anything else, the distant growl of an approaching engine snapped through the silence. Connor's muscles tensed instantly, his hand dropping to the gun at his hip. Duke's ears perked up, his body stiffening as he lifted his head. The dog let out a low, warning growl. Carter sat straighter, his fingers curling into fists. Connor stood, moving to the window, careful to keep himself in the shadows. The road leading to the cabin was little more than a dirt path, barely used. But now a single bike rumbled into view, kicking up dust as it slowed. Connor's grip tightened on his gun until he recognized the rider. Rick. The tension in his chest eased, but only slightly. Rick pulled up near the porch, swinging off his bike in one fluid motion. His clothes were slightly torn, a smear of blood on his sleeve that wasn't his. He pulled his helmet off, shaking out his dark hair before looking straight at the window. "You gonna let me in, or am I just talking to myself out here?" Connor exhaled, stepping back and unlocking the door. Rick strode in without hesitation, nodding toward Carter. "Good, you're still breathing," he said, then glanced down at Duke, who merely flicked his ears in response. "And the dog still got both eyes. Guess last night wasn't a complete disaster." Carter huffed a tired laugh. "Nice to see you too." Rick turned back to Connor, his expression shifting to something darker. "We got a problem." Connor's stomach sank. "What kind?" "The kind that means we're running out of time." Rick leaned against the counter, rubbing at his jaw. "Vanguard's moving fast. I made a few calls, checked some sources. They're locking the city down. They know Carter's alive, they know someone took him, and they're not waiting around to see who turns up. They're looking, he paused, for us. Connor expected as much, but hearing it confirmed only solidified the reality they were facing. How bad? Bad enough. Rick exhaled. They're watching every road in and out of town, staking out known Black Hawk spots. They even shook down a few people asking questions about you. Carter ran a hand through his hair, muttering a curse under his breath. We don't have the luxury of playing this slow, Rick continued. That drive? It's our only shot, and if we're getting it, we need to go now. Connor nodded, already running through the logistics in his head. How many men they got posted at the bank? Rick shrugged. Not sure. Probably just eyes for now. They don't know when or if we're coming, but if we wait too long, they'll start putting the pieces together. Connor looked at Carter. The man was exhausted, but he was pushing through it, his eyes sharp despite everything. He wasn't backing down. Can you move? Carter flexed his fingers, rolling his shoulders with a wince. I've had worse. Rick smirked. That's the spirit. Connor turned back to the window, staring out at the quiet stretch of land, knowing this peace wouldn't last much longer. Then we hit the bank tonight. Rick let out a low whistle. We're really doing this, huh? Connor glanced down at Duke, who was already standing, ears forward, waiting. He reached out, scratching the dog's head. Yeah, he murmured. We're doing this. Because there was no turning back now. The city stretched before them, dark and restless under the glow of flickering streetlights. Connor kept his hands tight on the handlebars of his Harley, weaving through back roads and side alleys, the roar of the engine barely a murmur beneath the pounding of his heart. Rick followed close behind, Carter sandwiched between them in an old pickup they'd stolen outside of town. Duke sat beside him, body tense, ears pricked, his gaze locked on the road ahead. He knew, just as they all did, that this wasn't just another job. This was the last move on the board, the final hand in a game none of them had wanted to play. Either they walked away with that drive and exposed Vanguard for what they were, or they didn't walk away at all. Rick's voice crackled through the earpiece. Security's light, he said, watching from a rooftop across the street. 2 guards at the front, 1 in the back. No sign of reinforcements yet, but I don't like our odds if this drags out. Connor exhaled. Then we make it fast. He looked over at Carter, who was checking his gun, his movements stiff but determined. You ready for this? Carter gave a tired grin. Been ready since the moment they put a bullet in my vest. Connor nodded, pulling his mask over his face as he cut the engine a block away. The bank loomed ahead, its glass front reflecting the neon glow of a nearby diner. It wasn't much, just a small-town branch, but the safe deposit boxes inside held everything they needed to put Vanguard 6 feet under. Rick moved first, dropping down from his perch, knife flashing in the dim light as he dispatched the first guard before the man even knew what hit him. The second barely had time to react before Carter put a silenced round through his leg, dragging him into the shadows before he could make a sound. Duke slipped in beside them as they moved toward the entrance, his steps silent as death. Connor reached the door first, picking the lock with practiced ease, heart steady despite the weight of what they were doing. Once inside, the cool air of the bank wrapped around them, sterile and undisturbed, the scent of fresh ink and old money lingering in the stillness. They moved quickly, Carter leading them toward the back where the safe deposit boxes were kept. He punched in an old access code, one he'd memorized before all this started, and the heavy door slid open with a quiet hiss. The hallway beyond was lined with numbered boxes, each one containing the secrets of the town's wealthiest citizens. But they weren't interested in any of those. Box 237. Carter knelt in front of it, hands shaking slightly as he worked the key into the lock. This is it, he muttered, twisting it until the latch gave way. He pulled the box out, pried off the lid, and there it was. A small, black hard drive, unmarked, unassuming, but holding more power than anything else in this building. He exhaled, gripping it tight. We got it. Then the alarm went off. A sharp, piercing wail that cut through the silence like a knife, bouncing off the walls, sending red lights flashing across the room. Connor cursed, shoving Carter to his feet. Time's up. Rick's voice came through the earpiece. We got company. Connor didn't need to ask how many. He could hear the screech of tires outside, the heavy stomp of boots against pavement. Vanguard had been waiting. This had been a trap from the start. We need an exit, Carter gritted out, stuffing the drive into his pocket. Rick was already moving, scanning for options. Side alley, north exit, but we gotta move now. Duke let out a low growl as the first set of boots crossed the threshold. Connor turned just in time to see the lead mercenary step through the door, rifle raised, his face a mask of cold precision. Connor fired first. The shot cracked through the air, hitting the man dead in the chest, sending him sprawling. But more were coming. Too many. They ran. Connor led the way, shoving past rows of overturned chairs, ducking as bullets shattered the glass walls around them. Carter moved slower, his injuries dragging at him, but Duke stayed by his side, teeth bared, ready to tear apart anything that got too close. Rick kicked open the side door, leading them into a narrow alley, but their luck had run out. A black SUV screeched to a halt in front of them, cutting off their escape. The driver stepped out and Connor recognized him instantly. Logan Maddox, Vanguard's enforcer. Maddox smirked, leveling his gun. You really think you were gonna win this? Connor kept his own weapon steady, eyes flicking between Maddox and the men behind him. Too many to fight, not with Carter barely standing, not with Duke at risk. Give me the drive, Maddox said, his voice almost bored. And I'll make it quick. Carter let out a rough laugh. You really expect us to just hand it over? Maddox tilted his head. Number, but I expect you to die. Then Duke moved. The dog launched forward with the speed of a bullet, teeth sinking into Maddox's arm before the man could react. Maddox screamed, firing wildly as he struggled to shake the dog off, but Duke held firm, dragging him down. Connor didn't hesitate. He shot the closest mercenary, then grabbed Carter and shoved him toward Rick. Go! They ran, bullets whizzing past, their feet pounding against the pavement. Duke caught up a moment later, blood staining his muzzle, but his eyes were alight with victory. They reached the bikes. No time to think. No time to breathe. Engines roared to life as they tore out of the alley, tires screeching against the asphalt, gunfire ringing out behind them. Connor didn't look back. They had what they came for. Now they just had to live long enough to use it. They didn't stop until they hit open road, the city fading behind them, the wind drowning out everything except the sound of their own breathing. Connor slowed, finally glancing over at Carter, who clutched the hard drive like it was the last piece of himself. You good? Carter nodded, breathing hard. We just pissed off the most dangerous people in the country. Connor grinned. Yeah, but now we can burn them to the ground. Duke let out a sharp bark, as if agreeing. The road stretched ahead, endless and uncertain. But one thing was clear. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning.